In a world where words often failed, their hearts spoke a language only they could understand. It was a silent symphony, a dance of glances and unspoken promises that bound them together. They didn't need speeches or declarations. Their souls whispered truths that words could never capture. The cafe was alive with the hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, and the occasional burst of laughter. She sat by the window, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug, lost in thought. The sunlight streaming through the glass painted her in a soft glow, and she seemed almost ethereal, like a figure from a dream. He noticed her the moment he walked in. It wasn't her beauty alone that caught his attention, though she was undeniably striking. It was something else, something intangible. A pull, a magnetic force that drew him in before he could even process what was happening. He paused, his hand still on the door, and for a moment, the world around him faded. Their eyes met. It was just a glance, fleeting and accidental, but it lingered. Time seemed to slow as they held each other's gaze, the noise of the cafe dissolving into a distant hum. In that moment, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement, a recognition that went deeper than words. She looked away first, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. He exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding his breath, and forced himself to move. He found a seat at a nearby table, his heart racing in a way that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. He couldn't explain it. He didn't even know her name, but something about her felt familiar. As if he'd known her in another life, as if their souls had been waiting for this moment to collide. She glanced at him again, this time more cautiously. He offered a small smile, one that she returned hesitantly before turning her attention back to her coffee. But the air between them had shifted. It was charged, electric, as if their silent exchange had set something in motion. The hours passed, and neither of them left. She stayed at her table, occasionally stealing glances in his direction. He pretended to read a book, but his eyes kept drifting to her, drawn like a moth to a flame. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, she gathered her things and stood. He watched as she hesitated near his table, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, but then she simply smiled, a soft, almost shy smile, and walked out the door. He sat there, stunned, as the warmth of her smile lingered in the air. It was just a smile, but it felt like a conversation, like she'd spoken volumes without uttering a single word. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Her face kept appearing in his mind, her smile replaying like a scene from a movie. He wondered who she was, what her voice sounded like, what stories lay behind those quiet eyes. But more than anything, he wondered if she felt it too, that inexplicable connection, that silent language their hearts seemed to share. The next day, he returned to the cafe, hoping she'd be there. And she was. She sat in the same spot by the window, her presence as calming as the first time he'd seen her. This time, she looked up as he entered, and their eyes met again. That same spark, that same unspoken understanding, passed between them. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over to her table. "Hi," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She looked up at him, her eyes wide but not unwelcoming. "Hi," she replied, her voice like a melody he hadn't realized he'd been waiting to hear. They didn't say much after that. He sat down and they talked about the weather, about books, about nothing and everything. But the real conversation happened in the pauses, in the glances they exchanged when the other wasn't looking. It was in the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way he leaned in slightly when she spoke, as if hanging on every word. By the end of the afternoon, they still didn't know much about each other. But it didn't matter, because in the silence between their words, their hearts had already begun to whisper. The days turned into weeks, and their meetings at the cafe became a ritual. Every afternoon, she would sit by the window, and he would join her, their conversations flowing as naturally as the steam rising from their cups. But it wasn't the words they exchanged that deepened their bond. It was everything that went unsaid. It was in the way their hands brushed when he passed her the sugar, sending a jolt of electricity through both of them. It was in the way she laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and he found himself smiling even before she finished her sentence. It was in the way they could sit in silence for minutes, the quiet between them comfortable and full, as if their hearts were carrying on a conversation of their own. One rainy afternoon, the cafe was quieter than usual. The pitter-patter of rain against the windows created a soothing rhythm, and the world outside seemed to blur into a watercolor painting. She stirred her tea absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on the droplets sliding down the glass. "Do you ever feel like some people just understand you?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made him look up. He studied her for a moment, noticing the way her brow furrowed slightly, as if she were trying to piece together a puzzle. "Yeah," he said finally. "Like you don't have to explain yourself. They just get it." She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Exactly." There was a pause, and in that pause something shifted. It was as if they'd both acknowledged the invisible thread that connected them, the one that had been there since the first glance. Neither of them needed to say it out loud. They could feel it, a quiet certainty that settled in their chests. As the weeks turned into months, their connection grew stronger. They began to spend time outside the cafe, exploring the city together. They wandered through parks, their footsteps falling in sync, and sat by the river, watching the water ripple under the moonlight. One evening, as they walked through a quiet street lined with old lampposts, she stopped suddenly and turned to him. "Do you believe in soulmates?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I believe there are people who fit. Like they're meant to be in your life, even if you can't explain why." She smiled, a small, knowing smile that made his heart skip a beat. "I think I believe that too." They continued walking, their shoulders brushing lightly, and he couldn't help but feel that they were on the brink of something big, something life-changing. But for now, it was enough to be here, with her in this moment. There were times when words failed them, but it didn't matter. They had their own language, one made up of glances and gestures and the spaces between breaths. When she was upset, he could tell by the way she clenched her fists, and he'd reach out to gently uncurl her fingers, his touch saying what words couldn't. When he was lost in thought, she'd place a hand on his arm, grounding him without needing to ask what was wrong. One night, they found themselves on her rooftop, the city lights stretching out before them like a sea of stars. They sat side by side, their knees touching, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. "I feel like I've known you forever," she said finally, breaking the silence. He turned to look at her, the soft glow of the city reflecting in her eyes. "Maybe you have," he replied, his voice barely audible. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that made his chest ache. "Maybe." They sat there for hours, talking and laughing and falling into comfortable silences. And as the night deepened, he realized something. He didn't need to say, "I love you," to make her understand. She already knew. It was in the way he looked at her, in the way he leaned in when she spoke, in the way his hand found hers without hesitation. Their love was a quiet thing, built on moments that might have seemed small to anyone else. But to them, those moments were everything. A shared glance across a crowded room, a brush of fingers as they reached for the same book, a smile that said more than words ever could. These were the threads that wove their story together. And as they stood on that rooftop, the city humming below them, they knew that their connection was something rare. It wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't need to be. It was a silent language, a whisper between two hearts that had found their way to each other. For a while, their love felt like a sanctuary, a quiet, unshakable haven where nothing could touch them. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The storm came unexpectedly, as storms often do, and it tested the very foundation of what they had built. It started with small things. He began working longer hours, his stress manifesting in clipped responses and distant glances. She, in turn, withdrew, her insecurities whispering doubts she couldn't quite silence. The unspoken language that had once been their strength now felt like a barrier, their hearts struggling to hear each other's whispers over the growing noise. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, He arrived at her apartment late. She was sitting on the couch, a book in her hands, but her eyes weren't focused on the pages. She looked up as he walked in, her expression unreadable. "Hey," he said, his voice tired. "Hey," she replied, her tone flat. He sank into the chair across from her, running a hand through his hair. "Long day," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She nodded but didn't say anything. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, and neither of them knew how to break it. The days that followed were much the same. They still saw each other, still went through the motions, but the ease they'd once shared was gone. Their conversations felt forced, their touches hesitant. It was as if they were both waiting for the other to say something, to fix whatever was broken. But the words never came. One night, after another tense dinner, she finally broke. "Do you even want to be here anymore?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" "This," she said, gesturing between them. "Us. It feels like you're a million miles away." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "I'm just stressed, okay? Work is crazy right now, and It's not just work," she interrupted, her voice rising. "It's everything. You don't talk to me anymore. You don't look at me the way you used to. It's like I'm losing you." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. He stared at her, his chest tightening as he realized how much his silence had hurt her. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice soft. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way." She looked away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I miss us." The next few days were a blur of apologies and attempts to reconnect, but the damage had been done. The storm had left its mark, and they were left picking up the pieces. One evening, they found themselves back at the cafe where it had all begun. The familiarity of the place was both comforting and painful, a reminder of what they'd once had. They sat at their usual table by the window, the silence between them heavy but not unkind. "Do you remember the first time we met?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. He looked up, surprised. "Of course I do." She smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I thought you were going to walk right past me. But then you stopped and, I don't know. Something just clicked." He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah. It felt like I'd been waiting for you." There was a pause, and then she reached across the table, her hand covering his. "I don't want to lose this," she said softly. "I don't want to lose us." He turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You won't," he said, his voice firm. "We'll figure this out. Together." The road to healing wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, still nights when the silence felt too heavy to bear. But they fought for each other, for the love that had once felt so effortless. They learned to listen, not just to the words, but to the spaces in between. One night, as they sat on her rooftop under a sky full of stars, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He turned to look at her, his brow furrowed. "For what?" "For not saying anything sooner," she said. "For letting the silence grow." He shook his head, pulling her closer. "We both did that," he said. "But we're here now. That's what matters." She nodded, her eyes closing as she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I love you," she said softly. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you too." The storm had tested them, but it hadn't broken them. If anything, it had made them stronger. They had learned that love wasn't just about the quiet moments. It was about weathering the storms together, about finding each other even in the chaos. And as they sat there, the city lights twinkling below them, they knew that their love was worth fighting for. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And that was enough. Time has a way of smoothing out the rough edges, of turning storms into distant memories. For them, the years that followed were a testament to the resilience of their love. They had weathered the chaos, and in its place, they found a deeper, more profound connection, one that didn't need words to thrive. Their love became a quiet constant, a steady rhythm that carried them through the ups and downs of life. They no longer needed grand gestures or loud declarations. Instead, They found beauty in the mundane, in the everyday moments that made up their shared existence. It was in the way he'd leave a note on the fridge when he left for work early, a simple "good morning, love" that made her smile as she sipped her coffee. It was in the way she'd save him the last slice of pizza, even though it was her favorite, because she knew how much he loved it. It was in the way they'd sit together on the couch after a long day, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand absently playing with her hair. One evening, as they walked through the park where they'd shared so many memories, she stopped suddenly and turned to him. "Do you remember when we first met?" she asked, a playful smile tugging at her lips. He chuckled, shaking his head. "How could I forget? You were sitting by the window, looking like you'd stepped out of a dream." She laughed, the sound light and melodic. "And you just stood there, staring at me like a lost puppy." "Hey," he protested, feigning offense. "I was captivated, okay? There's a difference." She grinned, linking her arm through his as they continued walking. "I'm glad you were," she said softly. "I'm glad you didn't walk away." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "Me too." As the years passed, their love only grew stronger. They celebrated milestones together, birthdays, anniversaries, quiet nights in, and spontaneous adventures. They built a life, one filled with laughter and warmth and the kind of love that felt like home. One winter evening, they found themselves back at the cafe where it had all begun. The place had changed over the years. New paint, new furniture, new faces, but the essence of it remained the same. They sat at their usual table by the window, the snow falling softly outside, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with wonder. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "All the time," he said. "And I wouldn't change a single moment of it." She smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Not even the hard parts?" "Especially the hard parts," he said firmly. "They made us who we are." There was a pause, and then she squeezed his hand. "I love you," she said, her voice steady and sure. He smiled, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I love you too." Their love wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was in the way they could sit in silence for hours, each lost in their own thoughts, yet still feel connected. It was in the way they could argue one moment and laugh the next, their bond unshaken by the occasional storm. It was in the way they could look at each other and know, without a doubt, that they were exactly where they were meant to be. One night, as they sat on their rooftop under a sky full of stars, she turned to him. "Do you think we'll always be like this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Like what?" "You know," she said, gesturing between them. "Us. This." He smiled, pulling her closer. "I don't know what the future holds," he said. "But I do know that as long as we're together, we'll be okay." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yeah," she said softly. "We will." Their love was a quiet force, a steady presence that carried them through life's twists and turns. It wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't need to be. It was in the way they could communicate with a single glance, in the way their hearts seemed to beat in sync, in the way they could find each other even in the darkest of times. And as they sat there, the stars twinkling above them, they knew that their love was eternal. It was a whisper that would never fade, a bond that would outlast even the loudest silences. Years turned into decades, and their love remained, a quiet, unwavering force that defied time. The world around them changed, as it always does, but their bond stayed the same. It was a love that didn't need grand gestures or loud proclamations. It was written in the quiet moments, the stolen glances, and the unspoken truths that only their hearts could understand. They grew older together, their hair streaked with silver and their faces lined with the marks of a life well lived. But even as their bodies aged, their love remained timeless. It was in the way he still reached for her hand when they walked, his grip steady and sure. It was in the way she still smiled at him, her eyes lighting up as if they were still those two young souls meeting for the first time in a cafe. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, She turned to him. "Do you remember when we first met?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with warmth. He chuckled, the sound low and familiar. "How could I forget? You were sitting by the window, looking like you'd stepped out of a dream." She laughed, the sound light and melodic, just as it had been all those years ago. "And you just stood there, staring at me like a lost puppy." "Hey," he protested, feigning offense. "I was captivated, okay? There's a difference." She grinned, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad you were," she said softly. "I'm glad you didn't walk away." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "Me too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Me too." Their love had become a quiet legend, a story whispered among their friends and family. It wasn't the kind of love that made headlines or inspired epic tales. It was the kind of love that lived in the everyday, a love that was felt in the way they still made each other laugh, in the way they still held each other close on cold nights, in the way they still looked at each other as if no one else in the world existed. One winter evening, as they sat by the fireplace, she turned to him. "Do you think we'll always be like this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Like what?" "You know," she said, gesturing between them. "Us. This." He smiled, pulling her closer. "I don't know what the future holds," he said. "But I do know that as long as we're together, we'll be okay." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yeah," she said softly. "We will." As the years passed, their love only grew deeper. It was in the way they cared for each other, in the way they supported each other through life's challenges, in the way they celebrated each other's joys. It was a love that didn't need words to be felt, a love that spoke in the quiet moments, in the gentle touches, in the shared glances that said more than words ever could. One night, as they sat on their rooftop under a sky full of stars, she turned to him. "Do you remember when we first came up here?" she asked, her voice filled with nostalgia. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Of course I do. We talked for hours, and I realized I never wanted to be anywhere else but with you." She smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I felt the same way," she said softly. "I still do." He reached for her hand, his grip steady and sure. "I love you," he said, his voice steady and sure. She smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "I love you too." Their love was a quiet force, a steady presence that carried them through life's twists and turns. It wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't need to be. It was in the way they could communicate with a single glance, in the way their hearts seemed to beat in sync, in the way they could find each other even in the darkest of times. And as they sat there, the stars twinkling above them, they knew that their love was eternal. It was a whisper that would never fade, a bond that would outlast even the loudest silences.